confession at the backside of the church. Also, the last couple of weeks I've given a certain number of homilies, obviously, on the crisis that we're facing with COVID and the vaccine. And so for those who may not have seen those, please do go and have a look at them to get the full perspective of what I'm saying on the vaccine difficulty that we face. Because maybe if you only watch one of the homilies, a person could get the wrong impression and then wrongly conclude, as has happened, that I'm anti the vaccine and running a campaign against the vaccine, which I am not. And if everyone watches all of the homilies, they will see that in fact that is not what I'm saying. And I have been affirming basically just the conscience rights of Catholics and the need to assess everything, to have an informed consent before one makes a decision either way. And we've been through that for those who have been here the last number of weeks. Also, just a small clarification. Last week when I was looking at the moral issue to do with the abortion taintedness of the Pfizer vaccine, which we have here in New Zealand, I mentioned and it was in fact taken from a video that I had accessed from a biologist and a virologist, saying that in order to obtain the HEK, human embryonic kidney tissue, from aborted fetuses, in order to use them and immortalize those cells and then use them in testing for all sorts of medicines, including the vaccines for COVID. I mentioned that up to 100 babies would need to be aborted. In fact, that is incorrect. That was a false information that was put through by that biologist, a wrong information, maybe innocently given. Basically, the truth is that only one baby would need to have been aborted for those cells to have been taken from the kidney, harvested, and then immortalized for all of the ways in which it's used now, unethically, of course, in the medical world, which we are not happy with at all as Catholics. Today, I just want to have a look again, unfortunately, and I know this might seem like a bit of something that's burdensome. I'm aware, and I feel it myself, a certain fatigue with this whole topic of the vaccine and the ethics around it and the whole problem with COVID. We are exhausted with all this stuff, and we're all well aware of it. But nonetheless, I still do feel a certain responsibility, and it's part of the service that clerics, priests have to render to the faithful, is to instruct and to give light on complex issues like these that we have. And today I just want to have a look a little bit at the common good and whether what the government is mandating for the teachers and for healthcare professionals is indeed licit or not. To give some Catholic light on it from the teaching of the Church. It's not my personal opinion, and for those that have been following the previous weeks, I've deliberately shied away from giving my personal opinion. I've just simply given the principles and the teaching of the Church. Because we can all have blind spots. A number of years ago, we had Archbishop Coleridge come out from Australia and present a number of talks to the clergy in Auckland. And he was speaking of the sexual abuse crisis in Australia, the Royal Commission that was underway, and the things that they were learning in the church, and the changes and responses that especially the bishops were making over there to address the issues. And he was confidently putting forward all of the ways in which they'd learnt from the mistakes of the past and had made significant changes, and that this would not happen again. And in fact, it was myself, I raised a question and said, well, in the past we had blind spots on these issues, and we didn't know that these problems and blind spots were there. What is to say that we don't have blind spots now? And what are our blind spots now, not just on the sexual abuse crisis, but on any other crisis in the church, especially a spiritual crisis? Are there ways in which we pat ourselves on the back and think that we all go along, and yet there can be massive voids in our understanding of where things might be missing in our approach to things, especially in the church? Just to give you one example in history, St. Peter Claver, a beautiful saint of the Negroes who were taken from Africa into slavery and imported into the New World, South America, Central America, North America. St. Peter Claver served as a Catholic missionary in South America, and he served those that were coming in the galley slave ships and spent his whole life at trying to make their lives better. but there were Christian people who, thinking that they were legitimate, placed a segregation on them, mainly Spanish immigrants into South America, and would not enter churches if the Africans were there, and set up a kind of a two-tiered class society in that way based on skin colour. And that was a major blind spot. Those were probably decent Christian people going about trying to be decent, living decent Christian lives, but conditioned by the cultural attitudes of the day. And that can happen to us. We can easily be blinded, especially in a crisis or an emergency like a pandemic, and not realize that there are things going on that may not be acceptable, and we need to dig in to see whether our conscience can be enlightened by the Holy Spirit, to see if our own attitudes are right and whether even the attitude and society at large is right. And that's important, that we have people pushing back in that regard in our society. In fact, to keep us all honest and keep us all reflective of what our own attitudes are. And of course, we're so blessed as Catholics because we have access to a greater light, not just the philosophers, if there are any in our day, and people who ask moral questions, look for the truth, but we have light from heaven through the teaching of the Church, which gives us a massive head start. So let us dig into that a little bit today and look at the common good if we can, because it's a complex issue. What is the common good? And I've gone to a number of church documents, mainly the Catechism, but there are some fantastic documents that have been written by the popes in recent times. One of the ones that I really encourage you to read would be Pacem in Terris, Peace on Earth by John the 23rd, and you could look at his previous encyclical Mother and Teacher, which is also on the social order. And in the last 100 years or more, there have been many documents put out by the popes, beginning with Leo XIII, the famous Rerum Novarum on the social order, on social teaching. And from there, the Church has developed much of her thinking from the gospel and from the natural moral law on what her teaching is, social teaching. And part of that social teaching is clearly relates to the common good of communities. So what is the common good? Just to have a look at that in order to understand what is the responsibility of the government towards its citizens, especially in a crisis, and what are the rightful uses of its authority for its citizens in an emergency, and what could be the abuses of that authority. The common good is to be understood, this is from the Catechism 1906, meaning number 1906. Is to be understood as the sum total of social conditions which allow people either as groups or as individuals to reach their fulfillment more fully and more easily. The common good conserves the life of all in the community. It calls for prudence from each and even more from those who exercise the office of authority. It consists of three essential elements. So it's the sum total of social conditions in which and from which individual people can reach their fulfillment more easily and readily. And it has to be a true fulfillment, and it has to be based on objective goods and truths for that fulfillment to be reached. And it says it has three essential elements. The first is the common good presupposes the respect of the person as such and all of their inalienable rights and freedoms. We'll dig into that. The second is the social well-being and the development of the group itself. And the third is that it requires peace. So let me try to unpack that. As a foundation for the common good to be achieved, all in the group, including the authority in the group, in this case it's the government, has to, first of all, as a foundation, respect the inalienable rights and freedoms of all the individuals as persons in the group. And then they have to help, and with their authority, and that includes all of us, build up to create a social milieu in which the conditions from which that foundation is laid and in which that foundation exists, we can reach our fulfillment according to our human nature. So that implies a multiplicity of means that are built up in the community, built up from that foundation, all the social conditions so that all the individual members can reach their fulfillment in all the various ways that one looks for fulfillment. But of course there's going to be a commonality because we all have the same human nature. We're all human persons created in the image and likeness of God. And then for that to be achieved, foundation and then the social means in which that can be achieved, there needs to be an order, a just order in which there's a security and a stability, and that's what they mean by peace. So clearly, for the common good to be achieved, the rights, inalienable rights, have to be respected of the individual persons. And a government or a community that begins to ignore those rights, either of the whole lot or of a minority, will begin to undermine the common good and abuse, if they are in authority especially, abuse their service that they are called to give. And there, today, we're already in a situation where the common good is being undermined because certain rights of certain groups in our society are not respected at all. Obviously, in abortion, the unborn, we have now legal situations in where some members of society are allowed to directly abuse the inalienable rights of others, and they are helped to do so and protected to do so by the law in abortion. And that's coming now also with euthanasia and all the other ways in which the governments around the Western world have decided that they will push their own relativistic morality insofar as they constantly work against the natural moral law and against the proper true hierarchy of values given to us by God. They will all undermine the common good and slowly contribute to the breaking down and the destruction of our society. And there, the best way that that can happen is by breaking down the family. And that is going on in many, many ways around the world. New Zealand is no exception. So already we have abuse of certain individuals in our society by the authorities and by the laws and by the individual particular persons within the group towards others. So there's already a major problem in our society in terms of achieving the common good. So the question when it comes to a crisis or an emergency is, first of all, clearly the government must respect the rights, and there's no situation which would allow them to take away certain rights from people which are inalienable and are given by God. And this is where we are helped a lot as Catholics, because we see the common good not only from a natural perspective, but we see it in the supernatural perspective, that God also is giving all the hierarchy of values. So we see not only certain material conditions need to be met, social things built up for the common good, but spiritual things have to be respected as well. And we know as well as Catholics, and the West has been built on Christian principles, it should know, but it is choosing deliberately to forget, that those rights, inalienable rights, come from God. They are not conferred upon the human person by the state or the community. They come down from above. They are not conferred from below by the community having a consensus, and they are not conferred by the authority arbitrarily making up some rights and giving them to the constituents for which they are serving in their authority. Because if that be the case, it can be very arbitrary. All it takes is a change of law, and suddenly those rights are taken away, and that happened to the Jews in Nazi Germany, as we all know. And insofar as the Western society cuts its bond and proper knowledge of this truth, that it's God who gives those rights, and only looks with a kind of socialistic attitude, materialistic, evolutionary attitude towards the state, those things will become more and more arbitrary and relativistic and will be abused more and more depending upon the expediency of the group that has the power. And there it will be survival of the fittest, but in the community, wrecking the common good as we go forward. And it is true that even if you have a healthy society, a good government that respects all of these things, in an emergency, what are the things that can be then modified in a community to address the emergency that we're facing? For example, in a time of war, we all know and accept that whilst we have inalienable rights and freedoms which are foundational, there are all sorts of other civil rights and freedoms that exist at a secondary level, and in a time of war they get modified. There are food stamps, there's rationing, there's curfews at night, certain social freedoms, not foundational human freedoms, but certain social freedoms are limited and constricted because of an emergency. And it's true that the government has a rightful authority to regulate those things when they're facing an emergency or if there was a natural disaster, etc. There are definitely limits that are put on civil rights and civil freedoms, and we all accept that. And then, interestingly, and the Church affirms this in her teaching, it's in the Catechism, there even exists a situation where, because of a serious threat to the nation, and in the cause of defending the good of the nation, the culture, and all of the inhabitants of it, the government, those with authority in the state, actually have the power to conscript certain men of fighting age to serve in the military armed forces and to mount a defence against the threat that is coming against the nation. And there, what is being asked of is that those that are being conscripted actually actively choose to cooperate with it and willingly serve the common good, the patriotic sort of defence of one's country, defending one's wife and children and everything else, and put oneself in a place of danger, mortal danger in combat. One is putting oneself in a situation where one could well die at the service of the common good. And it seems in that one case, and the Catechism's clear that it's only in that case, the case of a serious national defence, one can be conscripted. And there it implies that even against one's will, be put in a situation where one's life is in threat, and possibly one could be asked to give their life in defence of the common good. But it seems that it's only in that case, when there's a serious threat to the whole community being utterly destroyed and the culture being wiped out. And this is where the whole debate around just war comes in. And in World War II, there was a massive response, seeing the moral cause to defend, for example, in America, let's just take that country. When they were attacked by the Japanese, they mounted a defense, and then in the end they joined the cause of the war in Europe. And there were many who voluntarily fought for that cause, and others who might have been conscripted. But even in that case, a good society, like the United States was in those days, allows for conscientious objection on legitimate grounds, where someone may not want to be in the armed conflict in that way and may serve in another way. So they give an exemption for certain types. Catholics were some among them, but many Catholics fought legitimately in the Second World War. When you look at the Vietnam War, the cause was more murky and blurry, and thereby there was a massive number who conscientiously objected to the draft and the way that it was being conducted. And that's why there were huge protests in the United States pushing back, believing that the government had overstepped its power and authority, and was asking them to put themselves in mortal danger, fighting men of that age, for a cause which was not just, in which case they legitimately pushed back, and there was massive pushback against the Vietnam War. Now, the reason I mention that is that there is one case there where the government has the authority and the power to put some of its citizens, men of fighting age, in a situation where their life could be lost. But they are not directly taking those rights away from them, the right to life. They're just simply asking them, for the sake of a greater good, the defence of the nation, the common good of the nation, be we willing to put themselves in a situation where they might lose their life. But it's the only case, in fact, because of what is needed in terms of justice. Now we drill down a little bit now, and we're facing these mandates where the government is asking a whole industry, teachers and healthcare professionals, to submit to a vaccine putting into their body, which is experimental, the safety of which has been questioned, the efficacy of which has been questioned, and that's a medical question I'm not going to touch, but it's up for debate. They are basically saying to them that you must take this or you will lose your job. And even if that was legitimate, just like in the case of conscription, The government is required in that case to provide for another means by which teachers and healthcare workers could proceed forward in the face of the difficulty. Everyone wants the health and good of children and the society, the protection of all of the good things that the pandemic has threatened. So there's a good end. But the question is, or the moral question is, are the means that are being employed to achieve that good end, the defence of the health of the nation, are those means legitimate, first of all? And is it the only means that can be employed? That's the first thing. Because we are, as we know in Catholic moral theology, and this is an inviolable principle, that we can never use an evil means to attain a good end. We can never use evil to serve the good. And there is a big question mark about whether there is an abusive means being used and it's being funneled, everyone's being funneled into one means. If we're not going to use lockdowns, they're saying that the only other way is vaccines, and thereby everyone has to submit to it, and they're using their authority to say, basically, you will not be able to work. And remember, the ability to work is a human right. It's recognised in the UN Charter on Human Rights, and it's recognised in the teaching of the Church. Now, some might say, but by the government doing this, they're not pushing people, they're not making it impossible for them to work, they can find another job. But that is questionable, because when you take a teacher who might be 52 years old and the only job they've ever done is teaching, and you're asking them to retrain in an entirely different industry because they're removing the right to teach across the entire country if you're not vaccinated, that is removing a fundamental right from a person. A person has a right to work in their chosen field. And to do that is highly questionable in terms of the ethics of it. They seem to be using an illegitimate means to attain a good end. And I would argue that it's an abuse of power. And it's not truly serving the common good, and ultimately it will undermine the common good in the long run. And further, as you've heard me say before, the Nuremberg Code that was developed after the Second World War because of what the Nazis did to the vulnerable and the handicapped and the weak and other of those that they'd forced, one can never be forced to take a medicine against their will. That is an inviolable right that has been recognised in the natural moral law, and the Church has repeated it recently in its document from the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith that it always must be voluntary. So to place oneself to place your citizens in a situation where they have to choose poverty or losing their house and all of the legitimate things that they've built up in their life by serving the common good and teaching and doing so much good work, you have to either choose destitution or take the vaccine, is an illegitimate choice that is forced upon them. They should be allowing religious exemptions if they were to do this, but I don't even believe that they have the right to do this, to be honest, ethically. They might have the legal right and they probably win the court cases, but I don't believe that it is moral what they are doing when they need to find other ways. And that's what the document from the Second Vatican Council said, that if one is not to take a vaccine, then there should be other means employed by which the community is protected. That good can be achieved not only by vaccines, but other mechanisms and other means. And I would say that the government has a responsibility to find other ways, other work for those teachers and those healthcare professionals, which in fact is impossible because they've laid it out to the entire industry, which shows, in fact, the immorality of what they're doing. To give you an example of how so easy it is that we have these blind spots, and in an emergency, it's so easy for the population to be brainwashed and kind of go along with an illegitimate and evil means to protect a good end. You remember the Second World War when the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor. Japanese citizens in America were rounded up without any respect for their freedoms and rights and put in essentially quasi-concentration camps for the duration of the war. They lost their houses, they lost their businesses, and they had no legal recourse by which to recover them. And now, after the fact, it has been recognized as an enormous injustice that was perpetrated against Japanese Americans. Because of the situation, the threat that was upon them, there was a kind of a strange delirium that came upon the internal community in the United States, and they thought that this was a just means by which to protect the national good, the common good. And now it's recognized that that was a fallacy. It was wrongly employed, and it abused the human rights of that minority. And it's so easy for a human community to do that when there is pressure, when there's an emergency, when there's a crisis, and especially when there is a certain manipulation of the media, of the information presented by the media, such that they whip up a certain social consensus to do something illegitimate. And I certainly think that we are heading towards this. The response to a crisis and emergency, a legitimate emergency and a legitimate crisis, the legitimate response has to be proportionate, and it should never be at the expense of inalienable human rights. And if it is, we have an abuse of power going on, and we will have this breakdown of the social order. And if it goes further, it will lead to further disorder and even aggression and violence in the community if you let it run dangerously. And there, my brothers and sisters, we have to be very, very aware of how what our Catholic attitude is to these things, and to make sure that we're informed by the teaching of the Church, not just by a certain kind of intuition, because these days people's moral intuition, I find, is often amiss, even Catholics, because they let themselves be fed every day by the ideas in the media and on the radio and on the internet. And many times these people have essentially a socialistic idea of the community. Just before we head into looking at socialism and how that touches on what we're speaking about, just to give you some examples of how to get more light on this. We all know that people have made analogies in recent times when they say the government's been encouraging everyone to have the vaccine. And once again, I'm not anti-vaccine. If it does some good, fair enough, take it. People have made analogies like, but the government has run a campaign in the media to help people to put on their seatbelts, to do things for their own protection, and fine, that's all very good. We all know the safety that seatbelts give, but they are things external to the human body. If you put your seatbelt on and it's got some stickiness on it, you can take it back off and clean the stickiness off. If you put on a seatbelt and it's proven to be a defective seatbelt, the company can recall it, and you can replace the seatbelt and you can buy a different car. But if there's a defective problem with a vaccine and you put it into your body, you can't take any of that back. That's now inside you. And there it makes the vaccines a whole other moral category compared to things that are put upon you and even mandated upon you from the outside by the authority for the sake of the common good. And seatbelts are one example, or other eye tests that might go on for driver's license, and you've heard me speak on that stuff before. There's a huge difference to putting things in you. And to use another example of things that go into you, imagine we had a terrorist attack in New Zealand, and people were so concerned because they hadn't had any knowledge on the movements of these terrorists, and they were like absolutely invisible ghosts. Imagine if the government came out and said, right, in order to protect the common good and to really reply to this threat, we are mandating that every citizen has to put a computer chip under their skin so that everyone's movements are monitored. We would be outraged by such a thing. And yet the vaccine mandates are in a similar order. And we would see that in the case of the computer chip, it is a response that is disproportionate and that is abusing the human rights of the citizens at the service of a so-called good end. And it might even be a true good end, the defense of the common good, national threats, etc. But as I have said, we are not allowed to use illegitimate means, evil means, to attain good ends. And there are large question marks about the way the government is going about these mandates. And they're being sneaky because they know that they can't force the entire population. There would be a massive uprising. So they're selectively choosing certain industries to get this ball rolling. And we know that they'll have some good ideas around why. I'm sure teachers and healthcare professionals, we can all see the normal logic of that. But I have large doubts about the morality of it and the ethics that sits in behind it. And just to go back to that question of socialism, you can err when you're looking at the common good, the foundational human rights, respecting the person, the social conditions in which those persons can then reach their true fulfillment, and the structure of peace and security and stability that's needed so that can all happen. That's a true Catholic understanding. Individual rights and the dignity of the person and the common good so that that person can be served to reach their end and fulfillment. And that includes a supernatural end as well, God. So worship strictly speaking, cannot be interfered with by the authority in the state. It's another question. But you can err on either side of this rightly ordered understanding that's very complex in our modern societies in the way that all the social milieu interacts, different rights and freedoms and duties there. One way we can err is by thinking that the community and the social good and the materialistic efficiency and productivity of the community outweighs the individual good. And if we think that, we are slowly stepping into a socialistic understanding of the community. And if we take it to its conclusion, we'll end in communism. And this is what distinguishes the socialists from the true realists in the Catholic sphere, but also elsewhere. If we think that the common good allows for the government to break and abuse inalienable human rights at the service of that common good, then we're essentially a socialist. And that's good for us to do a little examination of conscience on that, to make sure that we've got it right. And that is not saying that the common good is not legitimate, that there are certain things that can be mandated for the legitimately by the authorities for the common good, including certain modifications of civil freedoms and civil rights. It's fine, that goes on in any healthy, legitimate community. But what it means is that you can never take away the inalienable foundational human freedoms and rights. And if we think that's okay, we have essentially bought into a socialistic conception of the community that was conceived of by Karl Marx and then picked up by so many others in the 20th century, and in the end led to the murder of millions and millions and millions of people. Now, I'm not saying we're going to end up in that situation, so please don't anybody go running off and saying that Father Jeremy is saying that the vaccine mandates is the beginning of the murder of millions of people. But it is a dangerous step where we abuse and we think we have the right to abuse the rights of others at the service of a common good and a threat to the community. We must use legitimate means. And they were the main things that I wanted to highlight today in regard to the common good, to make sure that we have a Catholic understanding of them. I'm just surveying some of the notes that I've made to make sure that I've got and covered the things that I wanted to. I hope that's clear, and I just want to repeat, for the sake of those who might be tempted to think this, I have not been running a campaign against the vaccines. I am pro-vaccine. Do not buy into some of the ideas around the vaccines for children at all. And I am pro a vaccine trying to fight this disease entirely. But I think that it has to be proven to be safe, effective, and necessary. And it must always be voluntary. And there, my brothers and sisters, let us pray in these times as we face these trials to use also in our faith the best means to reply to the difficulties, the sufferings, and that is adoration. Facing the greatest trials when we're looking with Christian eyes from a spiritual perspective now, we must use the greatest means, which is adoration and contemplation. We must go up the mountain to face Christ in the transfiguration, go up the mountain to the crucifixion there and face the Lord so that we can hand everything to him. And it's in that kind of abandonment and surrender to the Lord as these other lower level things crush in upon legitimate citizens or things in society. We can be safe, we can thrive, we can come through the other side victorious in Christ. Let us make sure that we do that as we face these difficulties. Let us make sure that we pray and we adore so that we can be safe and secure in the heart of Christ. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit.